In the popular imagination, if you were admitted into a Victorian lunatic asylum, you didn't come out except in a box. For some this was the case, but for others, like Lillian Radford seen here, it was not. One definition of the word asylum states it's a place of retreat, security and shelter. The Bristol Asylum certainly had its faults, but for many it did provide a refuge and a retreat from the conditions which led to their incarceration. This film looks at the patients who recovered. These are the results for the 5,081 people who were admitted to the asylum in the 19th century. Over 2,000, or 45%, died, but there were nearly 2,000, or 36%, who recovered, and a further 392 who were classified as relieved. These figures would seem more impressive but for the fact that about a third of all admissions were people with physical diseases that at the time were incurable. Many of these people, especially those with general paralysis of the insane, later found to be syphilis, died, and often within months of being admitted, as this table shows. If we take these out of the equation, about 65% of those who were admitted with serious psychiatric problems were discharged as recovered or relieved. There were also the 15 who escaped and achieved their own form of recovery. This chart compares patient recovery rates categorised by address, sex, age, occupation and diagnosis. Where a person lived seems to make little difference. Emma Hooper lived in affluent Clifton, whilst Jane Bayliss lived in working-class Bedminster, but both recovered. If you were over 60 on admission, the chances of recovery were certainly diminished, perhaps because some suffered from what we now term senile dementia. An exception was Christina Pike, a 74-year-old who spent just under a year in the asylum, but was discharged as recovered. Occupation had virtually no bearing on recovery prospects, but what did was your diagnosis. Despite the uncertain nature of Victorian psychiatric diagnosis, what you suffered from was the biggest factor determining the likelihood of you recovering. If you had puerperal mania, you were very likely to recover. If you had general paralysis of the insane, GPI, you almost certainly did not. Here are examples of patients with different diagnoses who recovered, except for poor Thomas Reith, who had GPI and died 2 months after being admitted. Not all recoveries were the same, and we now present 3 very different examples of patients who recovered. The first being the woman from the start of our film, Ada Harriet Brooks. She was admitted on the 17th of February 1894 and was considered to be severely depressed, as this first photograph seems to indicate. She looks thin, her eyes look as if she's not slept for some time, and she seems distraught. Ada came from a fairly humble background. She was born on October the 19th, 1873. Her father was a labourer and they lived in the working class district of St Philip's. This is what it looks like now. She was only 20 when admitted to the asylum. She was a Methodist and she worked in a chocolate factory. She gradually improved but developed a nasty skin condition which can be seen in this second photograph. She does look less gaunt. The asylum was generally good at getting patients to put on weight. The photograph also conveys a message from the asylum. We do not discharge people until they are fully recovered. In this last picture, taken when she was discharged 14 months after her admission, her skin condition has gone, she looks well fed and her eyes are brighter. She even looks wealthier, she's wearing a bonnet and a fur-collared coat. There probably was a degree of manipulation of her image, but it seems incontrovertible that her mental state was much improved. Ada seems to have stayed well. Here in the 1901 census, she's back with her parents, and in 1911, she lives with her brother and his wife. Hubert was first admitted to the asylum on the 26th of September 1897, suffering from what the doctor described as acute mania. He was just 18 years old. His family appeared to be fairly prosperous. They lived in the well-to-do area of St Michael's Hill. His father was a tailor, as was Hubert. He described himself as an employer and had a couple of workers who boarded with the Stagg family. His mother, who was 10 years older than her husband, had suffered from religious mania in her youth and died in 1893 when Hubert was 13. His father remarried and Hubert acquired 3 more siblings. This upheaval in his life may have been a causal factor in his subsequent problems. His admission notes state he thought people were following him and he was hearing voices telling him he was made of black stuff. His father stated his son had been hearing voices for some time, but recently had become very restless, was talking incessantly, and was quite unmanageable. From his picture below, he looks a fairly ordinary young man, with a rather quizzical expression, not obviously agitated, but somewhat pensive. In a pattern that would be repeated several times, he was initially very agitated, being described as troublesome, restive, and ill-tempered. However, he quickly settled, and the phrase "working well at the tailor's shop" was used for the first time. His notes thereafter frequently describe him working well at the tailor's shop, with occasional outbursts of temper or agitation. He was discharged as recovered on the 4th of April 1898 after 7 months in the asylum. His freedom was not to last for long, and 3 months later he was back in the asylum. His presentation was essentially the same, though the doctors mentioned that he had commenced the habit of self-abuse. As the asylum provided no privacy for the patients, this was not surprising and shows how the Victorians still associated masturbation with insanity. This admission lasted for just 5 months, but he was again readmitted after just a short period at home. This third admission was to be different, and it would last over 5 years. Very few patients recovered after that length of stay, but for most of the period he doesn't seem to be that unwell, and is described as attending cricket practice, working on the land, and inevitably working well with a tailor. There are occasional relapses when he's described as strange in manner, but it seems he was kept in the asylum largely because his discharges were so unsuccessful. He seems to have fared better in the rigid confines of asylum life. He had a 4th and final spell in the asylum, lasting just 4 months. This followed the usual pattern of being fairly acutely unwell on admission, but soon settling. He was discharged in May 1907, and in those 10 years he had spent only 16 months at home. It's also unusual in that we have 3 photographs of him at the start of his first 3 admissions. They are similar in that he looks quite serious in all of them, but the second photo shows him looking quite defiant. By this time he knew the ropes and was not going to be intimidated, and in the last photo he bucks the usual convention by not looking at the camera. The doctors on his second admission describe him as having a very cheeky face and as impudent, and on his third admission as displaying a strange and peculiar look about his eyes and face. These remarks seem at odds with the rather sombre-looking young man shown in the photographs. This perhaps shows how much we need to distrust both sources of evidence, with the doctor's remarks displaying their own prejudices and the Victorian photographic convention of a sitter looking serious obscuring their actual character. For the next few years, he stayed out of the asylum and was living in a boarding house. When war broke out in 1914, he signed up to the Worcestershire Regiment and later the Suffolks, with whom he served until he was killed in action on the 11th of September 1918, just 2 months before the end of the war. On the date he died, there were no current battles, so it was likely he suffered from wounds suffered in a previous engagement, possibly the Second Battle of the Somme. If he'd survived these wounds, he might have been sent back to the Bristol Asylum, which was being used for convalescing servicemen. It would have been apt. He gained both the British War and Victory medals. His demise seems particularly tragic. He survived his mental health problems to be discharged as recovered 4 times, possibly a record during this period. He also survived 4 years of the brutal carnage of World War I, only to die just before armistice. He deserves to be remembered. Alice Jane Wells was born in Bath in 1864. She married Charles, a journalist, and lived in a large house on the Wells Road. They had a child, Winifred, and also a live-in servant. Her background was thus quite privileged and shows the stereotype of the asylum patient as someone from society's lowest orders to be somewhat misconceived. Alice became pregnant again, but tragically the baby was stillborn. She became severely depressed and expressed paranoid delusions. On the 26th of October 1892, she was admitted to the asylum and was diagnosed as suffering from puerperal mania. Her case was a very serious one. On admission, she was described as having a wildness of expression, fierce language, absurd delusions, and an absolute and willful silence. It was stated that she was extremely depressed, and on the 14th of November 1892, 2 weeks after her admission, she tried to gouge her eyes out.
"You're trying to poison me."
After this, a caution card was issued for her to be closely observed. 2 weeks later, she attempted to suffocate herself and was still not eating. The asylum was very successful at keeping suicidal patients alive. The asylum was open for 16 years before its first fatal suicide attempt. Modern psychiatric hospitals have a far inferior record. Much of her paranoia centred around food. The asylum tried to get her to eat, but to no avail. She was then fed by tube and did not eat voluntarily until August of the next year. Feeding someone against their will in some ways seems barbaric, but should they have let her die? Most women with puerperal mania recovered quite quickly, but Alice's psychotic symptoms were compounded by the death of her baby. She was both grief-stricken and very afraid. She did recover, but very slowly. Her delusions continued, and only in November 1895 was her caution card cancelled, 3 years after her admission. She did get well, and after a successful week's trial at home, she was discharged on the 28th of November 1895. She remained well, and in 1901 was living in this nice house in St Andrews, again with a servant. In 1911, she had not had another child, but her husband was now a deputy editor, and materially, at least, her situation was quite fortunate. Her case illustrates the severity of puerperal insanity. She could easily have died. The asylum's response was very controlling. The constant surveillance and tube feeding that kept her alive may have increased her paranoia, but they did keep her alive and enabled her to recover. Thus we have seen 3 very different cases where the patient has recovered. We can never be sure why an individual recovered, but their stories are an antidote to the often very negative opinions about asylums. They were controlling, but all hospitals are. They have an inflexible routine, and their paramount duty was to keep their patients alive and help them recover. Considering their lack of treatment options and the poor physical and mental state of their admissions, the Bristol Asylum did a very good job.